So we have Josh Quint here, follow-up conversation about testing in reaction to OMP's proposal after the fourth meeting, before the fifth meeting. So Josh, appreciate you reaching out, appreciate the additional feedback you have. I'll just hand the mic over to you, and I'm sure I'll have some follow-up questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for taking the time. I apologize if there's some background noise here in our facility, but let me just jump right in and say, my name is Josh Quint. I represent Canuvo. We're one of the original medical marijuana dispensaries here in the state of Maine. Been operating since 2011, and testing is it has been a fairly complicated and emotional conversation over the years that this medical program has existed. There is a pretty sharp divide between folks who feel that testing is necessary in order for a medical program to essentially to have legitimacy, to be able to verify that what we are selling to our patients is actually clean and quality product, clean and quality cannabis, as we would all hope it to be. On the other side of the conversation is a group of what tend to be smaller operators who are very much opposed to mandated testing, not necessarily opposed to testing as a concept, but are opposed to mandated testing as part of the operating rules for the medical program, largely because they fear that the costs of complying with those mandated testing regulations would put them at a huge economical disadvantage and make it hard for them to survive. And I can certainly see both sides of this equation. And so part of what I've looked forward to about this OMP work group is an ability to, or is a potential ability for this group to come up with something in the middle, something that can acknowledge both of those perspectives and find something that works for the medical program. And so as part of that conversation initially over the first couple of work group calls, the OMP came up with a proposed testing protocol, which would phase in required testing over the next couple years, different elements each year, basically potency or cannabinoid profile generally in the first year, and then getting into microbial tests in the second, pesticides in the third year. This is something that I had initially brought up when the work group was being proposed as a way, again, just to defer some of the costs. If we are going to have mandated tests, to defer those costs over a couple years, so that a small operator isn't getting hit with all of those costs in one calendar year, and so that operators can know what that cost is going to be a year from now and 2 years from now. One of the most destabilizing aspects about working in this industry is that the rules change all the time, and that's, or at least it feels that way to an operator, and that makes it really difficult to plan your expenses, your operating capital for the coming year, to know what your margins are going to be, which is something that any business person wants to be able to do. And so I think, again, breaking out those requirements over a couple years and spelling out, 2 years ahead of time when a requirement's going to go into effect is a pretty valuable thing for a business operator to be able to plan. So I think that's pretty valuable. I think that the other aspect of the OMP's proposed testing guideline is the OMP doing spot testing. So basically going into medical retail shops and buying something off the shelf and then getting it tested. The way that that's laid out in this proposal is the OMP comes and does the test, and if I'm understanding this correctly, then the operator would assume the cost of that test after OMP had done it. And then if that test fails, then a subsequent series of further tests are required, and those would also be at the cost of the operator. I don't know how feasible this idea is, but given the amount of tax revenue that's generated by the medical program, I didn't know if it might be feasible to explore, depending on the scale of that spot testing, whether it would be feasible for the department, for the OMP, to take some of the tax revenue generated by the medical program and use it to cover at least that first spot check at the retail level. And then if the test fails, then the registrant would have to assume responsibility for further tests or remediation from there. That may not be a workable idea, but just to throw out as a notion, even if it's not a workable idea, having somebody go through the exercise of figuring out, roughly how many spot visits you would want to do in a year, how many products you would be talking about, how many tests you would be talking about, and what that total cost would be for a calendar year, either for the operators or for the department. I think that would be a useful exercise in kind of totaling up what the burden of some of this mandatory testing might be, which could be very useful when we get to a legislative session and trying to communicate a rule change down to registrants within the program. So again, may not be a feasible idea, maybe too much money or something, but and I would completely understand. But just to throw out that anybody likes the regulator taking on an extra burden instead of the operator, right? Like any operator would be very happy with that. And again, I think it would be useful to demonstrate what the scope of that cost might look like for a 12-month period.
Yeah.
So again, just a notion, but
I think we could probably ballpark what that would look like, what we have the capacity to do on a weekly, monthly, and then yearly basis,
right,
and come with that cumulative cost. Our thought was, look, this is a good way to mitigate costs on the industry side, even the smaller operators, understanding that I'm going to guess, and don't hold me to this, but if we were to use audit testing for all of the registrants within the program, we would probably audit test you once every 4 years.
right.
So that's kind of where we came from versus OMP not ever wanting to get in a place where we bankrupt the medical account because we would be the ones doing however many annually.
Sure.
But certainly something that we could be open to. It's tough when you talk about the revenue generated because our agency doesn't have access to that money that goes into the general fund, and that would take but we certainly have registration fees, and we could do back of the napkin math. I mean, it might limit us in what we could do as far as audit testing if the costs would fall to us. But worth a conversation.
Well, and there may be a broader point to be made here, Eric, which is that just my opinion, but I think that the legislature needs to be willing to provide more money to the OMP if it's going to expect different, operation of the program. It takes a lot of money to do this well. It takes a lot of money to do this well quickly. And I just think that there's a bit of a disconnect between, assumptions of what we can spend and what we can get back out of it. But that may be a broader conversation or a conversation for a different day.
Well, certainly there's a lot that we would like to be doing from a regular standpoint. You should certainly come to the legislature and tell them to give us more money. We would not turn it down.
I'm sure you wouldn't. But getting back to the testing protocol then. Talked about the implementation schedule, which I'm again very much in favor of. Talking about how to kind of minimize the economic impact and maximize the public benefit impact. I don't know if it would also make sense to change around the schedule that you laid out on this proposal for implementation. So, potency testing is really necessary and useful for product formulation, for edibles and things down the line. It's useful for concentrates and understanding, how much you're getting. But for flower in its in its base form, something that's going to be sold to a consumer and then smoked, potency is useful for that consumer to understand generally how strong the cannabis is that they're using, but doesn't have the same impact on the end user as the same potency test would for an edible. The potency has a much greater effect on a manufactured product than it does on the flower by itself. And I would argue that to the end user, something like the microbials or mold and mildew would actually have a greater impact on the product quality and their quality of experience than would the potency test. Again, I'm just talking about for smokable flower, but it might make sense to swap around that implementation schedule and have mold and mildew and microbials go sooner and potency go later, just for the smokable flower form. Just throwing that out there, but I thought that there was some logic to that might be a little bit helpful.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the idea, what the challenges with the working group and the limited time we have is like, so we all agree on some level that the testing should happen in some way, shape, or form that benefits patients, that mitigates any helps pass along or ease the burden to the business. I'm hoping that tomorrow we can possibly vote on a concept and kind of flesh out the details in that vision. It's a delicate dance that we're trying to accomplish here. And we have so much more to talk about tomorrow too, which it should be full of good conversation. We'll just say that.
Certainly. Another notion that I had for, again, a way to try to ease some of this burden, but get more operators on board with being able to make the testing work, would be to kind of figure out which tests really need to be specific to the batch or the strain that's coming through the process versus which tests can be done on a whole crop that's going through at one time. So like an example of that, potency is something that's going to vary from strain to strain or from batch to batch, even with the same room, because it's not as determined by the environment as it is the genetics of the plant. But something like mold and mildew, or particularly, pesticides would be the perfect example for the other side of this. If it's been sprayed in the room, you're fairly likely to find it anywhere. And so if we could structure these so that basically anything that you can glean from the broadest possible sample, you're doing so, and then only leaving the types of tests, again, like potency, that really need to be driven down to the individual strain or cultivar, would be mandated that way, to try to just reduce the total number of tests that have to be made as a way to make it easier for people to do testing at all.
I understand. I would just have to think through the sampling protocols for that. It makes it a little bit more complicated, but I understand what you're saying.
It does, but I mean, when we're talking about, I don't want to speak for other people, and we all get into hot water when we do that, but primarily the folks who are most worried about the economic impact of testing are the smaller providers, which makes sense. It's going to be an outsized impact to what they can return off of a single crop. And so if we're talking about a 500 square foot room, a lot of things can be done that have a pretty, a 500 foot view that can encapsulate what's in that room. And so if we can say, even if you're growing 6 different strains in this room, but 3 of the 4 tests you have to do, you only have to do 1 for the room. You don't have to do 4 for the room. That's a big economic impact. So
no, that makes sense.
Yeah. And granted, I'm not the testing expert. I'm not the one to kind of figure out either the sampling or necessarily even what best falls into those 2 categories. But that just seems like a low-hanging fruit approach for us to be able to get this on board without having it be overburdensome.
Are you supportive of the idea, again, with an eye towards protecting the smallest operators within the program? The testing, any type of required testing be for only products that end up on store shelves, like the most commercial of interactions?
I would very much agree. And, I think the conversations in the broader group have been pretty clear that we all feel that the smallest scale of operator, somebody who's just taking care of a couple of their friends or neighbors out of their home, doesn't need to operate at the same level as somebody with a commercial operation, a commercial building, a retail store, and a manufacturing center. So yes, I would definitely agree with that. The folks operating at the very smallest end of the spectrum and who don't even have a commercial property that they're operating out of would make sense to be exempt from this stuff.
What about the idea of, okay, so even if you were a commercial operator, the idea where it's almost voluntary, and if I'm operating a storefront and I decide to buy a certain type of product that has not been tested, I can do so, but there has to be a big warning sign on the label for patient transparency that says this has not been tested. I mean, a way of protecting public health, not the best approach, but certainly something that's been brought up.
Yeah, and at the very least puts the power in the hands of the consumer to say, like, and this is a point that's been raised a lot. There are a lot of consumers who don't seem to mind one way or the other, and that is their choice. It's not the choice that I would necessarily make, but that is their choice. And I think as long as it's an informed choice, then it's a perfectly legitimate one. So I'm again perfectly fine with an exemption and then communicating that exemption has been used. And so, this product has not been tested. You don't know exactly what the potency is, and you don't know how it was handled. And if that's the choice that you want to make, and you save whatever $10 on your eighth, then that's the choice that you want to make. And if you want to go somewhere that has tested product, then you choose to go in that direction. But
Right.
Given that there is a lot of variation within this medical industry, and given it's pretty difficult for us to rewrite those, the operating rules of the program to like break up that large variance in operators and redefine everybody, it does make sense to me to have the rules, but then to also have very clear exemptions for people that it doesn't really apply to. That's, it's a half step in both directions, and
Right.
keeps your bases covered so that more people can do testing and more people can continue to operate the way that they have been and not be penalized for it one way or the other.
Right. Interesting. Any other thoughts?
I did actually have a question. So about the spot testing that's proposed here, would the OMP be intending to only do the spot testing on products that were labeled as untested? Or would you be interested in also doing it on products that had a tested label to see what the variance might be or what a potential change might be from when the test was done before? And I only bring that up because one of the points that's commonly raised by people who are opposed to mandated testing is that the test results are going to vary all the time anyway. Which does happen. There's a fair amount of variance from lab to lab and operator to operator. And so an opportunity to check in on differences in lab testing results from one lab to another and see if we can start to quantify what those differences might be. Again, that may be beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but there are a lot of areas where we don't have good data and where there are kind of assumed variances in both the data and the experiences that we do have. It would be nice to be able to start to fill those things in. But again, that may be a further discussion than we're actually having.
That's a great question, one that I hadn't really considered. I think you would have to, I think a lot would depend on whether there's voluntary testing with proper labeling versus, listen, we're going to require this set of panels for these commercial entities. And then what does that look like when talking about the auditing?
Yeah, no, that's fair. And
yeah.
I honestly think that I'm in favor of testing. I honestly think that either of those options, either the voluntary and well labeled or the mandated with clear exemptions for smaller operators and people that it would be really discriminatory against, I think either of those would be an improvement over what we have now. Because right now we have voluntary testing, the first option, but not necessarily 100% compliance with the labeling side so that the consumer knows what they're getting or not. So the option A, voluntary and well labeled, would be a first step, an improvement over what we have now. Second option, mandate with clear exemptions, and kind of defined around the commercial scale of the operation, in my opinion, would be the better of those two choices, but requires more work, requires, kind of redefining some of the entity structure within the medical program. So you're picking kind of what's more commercial and what's less commercial, and would require, I think, more buy-in. If it's voluntary and labeling, there's going to be less opposition because it doesn't force anybody to do anything different than what they're doing now. If it's mandatory with redefinition and clear exemptions, at least some people will still be inconvenienced by that.
Yeah.
Which is not a good enough reason not to at least talk about it, but is the reality.
Right.
But I do think that either of those would be an improvement over what we have now.
Should be good tomorrow.
It's always interesting.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. Anything else before we wrap up?
I think that's good for me, and the only other thing would be if you guys were looking for, something more concrete or harder as for an opinion. But we can also get to that with the voting tomorrow. I didn't know if there's anything else you wanted to talk about, but I'm good on my end. Yeah,
no, it'll be interesting to see how it boils out. I mean, this is the first time that we'll have a divided report on our vote, and I'm wondering how many different routes are going. But I think the objective of the vote is not to move forward with a certain policy proposal and say, do this, or this is what we recommend.
Yeah.
We can present everybody's voice is going to span from, well, we have some people that said we should require testing if it's on storefronts. We have some people that say you should do mandatory with extreme labeling so consumers know. We'll have people that say we don't do anything, or just OMP does auditing. I'm hoping it doesn't get too complicated and too many reports. Otherwise, I fear that nothing will happen again. But hopefully we can get through it, because we still got to talk about tracking, which will be fun and exciting.
Yep.
And then some of the municipality stuff that we've left on the back burner for a while. But
yeah,
we'll get through.
If we don't, there's something to be said for if we don't get to a consensus and there are like 4 or 5 different notions of what we should do, it is useful for the legislature to have an idea of the complexity of what we're talking about. And if we come back and just say like, yep, we all agreed, this is the one answer. I mean, first of all, that wouldn't be true. But the second, yeah, it would be misleading for the very people who set up this process that we're in the middle of. They need to understand how the program works. They need to understand, again, that wide array of interested parties and stakeholders here, and that there's no decision that's going to affect everybody the same or everybody positively. Those aren't realistic expectations, but that doesn't mean we can't change anything. It just means we need to broaden our thinking a little bit. And part of that is the legislature giving the OMP more money, which is not something that is super popular for operators in my position to talk about. But if the OMP is able to do more, then ultimately less is going to be expected of us, and less is going to be up in the air and miscommunicated or misunderstood. There's a lot of chaos that doesn't need to be there in the process.
Yeah, sure.
That I think would make everybody's lives a whole lot easier, and would also save everybody money in the long run. But
we'll get there eventually.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate it, man.
Absolutely. Thank you for taking the time. Hope it was helpful, and we'll talk to you guys tomorrow.
We'll chat tomorrow. See you.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.